The city skyline glittered under the late-night glow of New York. Neon lights shimmered across the Hudson. Cars honked below, and life seemed to pulse with endless energy. And inside the tallest skyscraper tower that bore his name, Richard, Sterling sat in silence. His office stretched wider than most people's apartments, walls of glass showing the world he had conquered. Behind him, portraits of financial triumphs lined the walls. Richard cutting ribbons at new corporate buildings. Richard shaking hands with presidents. Richard on the cover of Forbes with the title, "The Man Who Owns Tomorrow." But the man himself sat in the shadows, hunched over, his $1,000 suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loose. His gray-streaked hair fell carelessly over his forehead, and his eyes, once sharp as blades, were bloodshot, heavy with sleepless nights. The desk before him was spotless, except for a framed photo. It was old, a little dusty. A boy, maybe 16, smiled wide, holding a basketball trophy, while Richard stood beside him in a stiff suit, his hand resting awkwardly on the boy's shoulder. That boy was Daniel, his only son. Richard stared at the picture, his lips tightening, Richard muttering, "That was the last time he let me stand beside him, for he told me I was a stranger in his life." He dropped the photo face down and pushed back in his leather chair. The room felt too large, too hollow, as if mocking him. He rose and walked toward the glass window. Below, the city moved like a machine, endless gears of ambition grinding away. Pressed his hand against the glass, whispering, almost to himself, "Richard, I built this city. I own half of it. But I can't even keep my own family from falling apart." His voice cracked, his breath trembled. The mask of the billionaire, the titan, the ruthless empire builder, slipped away, and what remained was a man suffocating in silence. He sank into the couch, his head buried in his hands, Richard whispering, "I can't correct this. I've failed. I've failed as a father. I've failed as a man." The words echoed inside the empty office. No board members to impress, no media cameras to smile for, no employees to command. Just Richard Sterling, the lonely man trapped behind his own empire. For the first time in years, tears slipped down his face. Across the street, under the grand marble staircase of Sterling Tower, a figure shifted in the cold. Wrapped in a tattered blanket, Samuel, the beggar, everyone overlooked, pulled his knees close to his chest. The city never noticed him. Businessmen in suits stepped around him. Tourists pretended not to see him, and police officers only glanced to make sure he wasn't causing trouble. But Samuel noticed everything. Noticed how people walked faster when they felt guilty. How parents clutched their children's hands tighter when they passed him. How some people dropped a coin not out of kindness but out of discomfort. Tonight, though, his tired eyes looked upward. He had seen Richard Sterling before, of course, everyone had. His face was plastered across billboards. But Samuel's attention wasn't on the billionaire's image. It was on the faint silhouette he could see through the glowing office window. A man hunched, shoulders broken, lips moving as if he were praying. Samuel tilted his head. He couldn't hear clearly, but his instincts told him enough. A man that powerful, crying? Samuel to himself, even giants fall to their knees when the weight becomes too heavy. He pulled his blanket tighter. He had no wealth, no home, no family, or at least not anymore. But he recognized despair when he saw it. And in that moment, a thought slipped through his mind like a whisper carried on the wind. Samuel softly, "I can correct it." It was strange. The words weren't for him, but for the man in that glass tower. A man drowning in success, but starving for meaning. The next morning, the Sterling Tower lobby buzzed with life. Employees in sleek suits rushed in, clutching coffees, tapping away on phones. Security guards stood tall, scanning everyone who entered. Richard stepped out of the private elevator, dressed impeccably again. The mask was back on polished shoes, tailored suit, commanding stride. But under it all, his face was pale, his eyes hollow. He crossed the lobby without looking at anyone. But as the glass doors slid open, a voice pierced the air. "Samuel, you can correct it." Richard froze. His head turned sharply toward the ragged man sitting on the steps. Samuel looked straight at him, eyes unblinking, voice calm but steady. "Richard, what did you just say?" Samuel adjusted his torn coat, his gaze never leaving Richard. "Samuel," I said, "you can correct it. Whatever it is that's eating you alive. You think you've failed, but failure only belongs to those who stop trying." For a second, Richard's breath caught. The words felt too sharp, too pointed. How could this stranger? No, he walked closer, his voice low but harsh. "Richard, do you have any idea who I am?" Samuel smirked faintly. "Samuel, I don't need to know your name to hear your soul." Richard's jaw tightened, the arrogance that shielded him for decades surged back. "Richard, you're just a beggar on my steps." "Don't pretend to understand me." Samuel didn't flinch. His tone remained calm, almost fatherly. "Samuel, money builds towers, but it doesn't fix hearts. You've got the world in your hands, son, but your spirit is in chains." Richard blinked, stunned. No one, no board member, no rival, no friend had ever spoken to him that way. For the first time in years.
Okay.
Richard felt something crack inside him. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to dismiss Samuel as a lunatic. But the words felt like they were meant for him and him alone. He turned sharply and strode away, but his steps were unsteady. Behind him, Samuel leaned back against the wall, his eyes following the billionaire until he disappeared into the crowd. Samuel to himself, "He'll be back." The broken always return to the place where someone finally hears them. The sun dipped low behind the skyline as Richard Sterling sat at the head of the long mahogany boardroom table. 20 executives in suits lined both sides, their faces tight with tension. Charts and projections glowed on the screen behind him, graphs showing profit margins, losses, and forecasts. Richard's hand gripped the edge of the table. He had poured months into a new project venture that he believed would redefine his legacy. A renewable energy empire to change the world. But now, his own board members were rebelling. Board member number 1, Richard. "With all due respect, the risk is too high. Investors are already nervous. We can't gamble billions on something that won't turn profit for decades." Richard snapping. "Decades? You think small? That's why you'll always sit in those chairs while I sit at the head of this table. This is about the future, my future." Murmurs rippled through the room. One of the younger executives, daring but nervous, leaned forward. "Board member number 2, your future." "Sir, this company isn't just yours. Thousands of families depend on its stability. We need to be practical." The words hit Richard like a slap. "Not just yours." For years, everything had been his empire, his rules, his triumphs. But now, even here, in the one place he still commanded, people were pulling away. His fist slammed on the table, silencing the room. "Richard, you think I don't know what I'm doing? I built this empire from nothing. Without me, you're all nobodies. Don't you forget that?" Silence. Cold, sharp silence. Then the chairman of the board, a man Richard himself had appointed years ago, cleared his throat. "Chairman, Richard, we voted before this meeting. The board is against moving forward. The project is terminated." The words drained the blood from Richard's face. He stared, unblinking, unable to comprehend. "Richard, terminated? Without my approval? I am this company, Chairman. You were this company, but your vision. It's not aligned with the majority anymore, I'm sorry." Richard staggered back into his chair. The first time in his career he wasn't in control. His chest tightened. The walls of the boardroom seemed to close in. He was losing his company, his legacy, his family, everything slipping through his fingers. He stood abruptly, ignoring the voices calling after him, and stormed out of the room. The city blurred around him as he walked. No driver, no bodyguards, just Richard. Moving aimlessly through the crowded streets, people brushed past, some glancing at him, but no one recognized the billionaire dressed in a simple black coat, his tie ripped loose. He stopped at a small park. Children laughed in the distance. A young father pushed his daughter on a swing, her giggles ringing like bells. Richard's throat tightened. His mind flashed back Daniel at age 6, begging him to push the swing just one more time. He had said no. He had a meeting, always a meeting. He sat on a bench, burying his face in his hands, Richard whispering, "I'm losing them. I'm losing everything. What have I done?" Tears burned his eyes. His empire couldn't save him. His wealth couldn't comfort him. For the first time, Richard Sterling, the man the world envied, felt powerless. Then a voice came from behind. Him, calm, raspy, yet sharp as a blade. "Samuel, I told you. You can correct it." Richard lifted his head, startled. Samuel sat at the other end of the bench, as if he had been waiting there all along. His clothes were ragged, his hands rough, but his eyes deep, piercing. Jacob looked directly into Richard's soul. Richard angrily. "You again? Why are you following me?" Samuel smiling faintly. "I don't follow anyone. People come to where they need to be, and you needed to be here." "Richard, what do you want from me? Money? Is that it? You think spouting riddles will earn you a few bills?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "Samuel, what would I do with your money? Buy a roof to hide under while my soul still sleep?" "Samuel, because Richard Sterling, for all your billions, you're starving too." Richard's breath caught. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time, the Titan had no defense. The park grew quieter as evening shadows stretched long across the grass. The laughter of children faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Richard sat frozen on the bench, his breath shallow, his fists clenched against his knees. Beside him, Samuel leaned back, as if perfectly at home on the weathered wood, his ragged coat rustling with the wind. He didn't stare at Richard directly. Now he just looked out at the horizon, his presence calm, steady, shaken. Richard was the first to break the silence. Richard bitterly. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've built, what I've sacrificed. You sit there homeless and think you have wisdom to offer me. You know nothing?" Samuel didn't flinch. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "Samuel, you're right. I don't know the numbers in your bank account. I don't know the square footage of your mansion or the brands stitched into your suits, but I know the look in your eyes. I know the sound of a man who cries when he thinks no one's listening. And I know the weight of regret, Richard. It's heavier than poverty. It crushes slower, but harder." Richard's head snapped toward him. "Richard, you..." He stopped himself, his voice cracking. "How do you even know my name?" Samuel finally turned his gaze, sharp and unwavering. "Samuel, I've lived on these streets longer than you've lived in that tower. I hear things. I see faces. You think the world doesn't talk about Richard Sterling, the great empire builder? The man whose smile is in every newspaper? You're not as hidden as you think." Richard swallowed hard, as the mask was crumbling, piece by piece. He wanted to lash out, to silence this ragged stranger, but another part of him, a small, desperate part, wanted to keep listening. Richard quietly, "So what then? You think you've read my soul? That you know what I've lost?" Samuel's smile faded. He looked down at his weathered hands, clasped together as if holding something fragile. His voice dropped lower, heavy with memory. "Samuel, loss is a language, son. Doesn't matter if you're sitting on marble floors or cold concrete. Sounds the same." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air grew heavy, thick with things left unsaid. Finally, Richard sighed, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Richard, last night I sat in my office, on the top floor of the tallest tower in the city, and I begged myself to find a way to fix what's broken. My son hates me. My wife won't even speak to me. My company is slipping from my hands. All I could whisper was, 'I can't correct this.'" His voice cracked. The words hung between them, fragile as glass. Samuel shifted closer, his expression solemn. "Samuel, that's why I said it, because I heard your cry, even if you think no one else did. You can correct it, Richard. But not the way you've tried before. Not with money, not with power. Those are hammers. And you're trying to fix shattered glass." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Richard, you make it sound so simple, but you don't understand. My son, Daniel, he doesn't want me. Walked out. He told me I was a stranger to him. How do you correct that? Samuel tilted his head. Samuel, by being what you never were before present. The word hit Richard like a blow. He blinked, confused. Richard, present. I was there. I paid for everything. His schools, his sports, his life. I gave him the best money could buy? Samuel shook his head, his voice calm but firm. Samuel, you gave him things, but not yourself. Tell me, Richard, when was the last time you sat and listened to your boy without a phone buzzing in your hand? When was the last time you showed up not as the great Richard Sterling, but as a father? Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came. His mind flashed to memories. Daniel tugging on his sleeve at the dinner table, asking him to watch a new basketball move. Richard had waved him off, scrolling through emails. Daniel waiting by the window for him to come home from work, only to fall asleep on the couch before Richard ever arrived. Shame burned through him. He closed his eyes, his voice dropping. Richard, I thought I was giving him everything.
I thought.
If I built a future for him, he'd understand. Samuel's voice softened, tinged with sorrow. Samuel, I thought the same once. With my little girl, she wanted bedtime stories. I gave her promises of tomorrow. She wanted my presence. I gave her excuses. And then one day she stopped asking. I realized too late tomorrow had run out. Richard turned sharply, studying Samuel's face. There it was, pain even deeper than his own. Richard whispering, "What happened to her?" Samuel looked away, his jaw tightening. His silence was answer enough. The two men sat in the gathering dusk, bound by a shared wound, one of wealth, and neglect, the other of poverty and regret. Finally, Samuel spoke again, his tone steady but piercing. Samuel, you asked me how to correct it. Start by showing up. Not with a gift, not with a grand gesture. Just show up. Sit in the stands, at his game. Knock on your wife's door, without a lawyer between you. Let them see you, Richard. Not the billionaire. Not the empire. You. Richard rubbed his face with both hands, his heart pounding. The advice was so simple, so painfully simple, yet it felt like climbing a mountain. Richard, and if they don't let me? If it's too late? Samuel's gaze hardened, his voice cutting like steel. Samuel, it's never too late until you're in the grave. The words echoed. Richard felt them settle deep, deeper than any speech from an advisor, deeper than any headline. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like Richard Sterling, the billionaire. He felt like Richard Sterling, the father, the husband, the man who had failed who desperately wanted to correct it. He leaned back on the bench, staring at the night sky. Richard quietly, why are you telling me this? Why do you even care? Samuel's lips curled into that faint, knowing smile again. Samuel, because son, I know what it's like to lose everything. And I see in you the chance to not make my mistake. If one man can be saved from my failures, maybe that's worth something. Richard looked at him for a long moment. The ragged coat, the weathered skin, eyes that carried storms and wisdom both. For the first time, he didn't see a beggar. He saw a mirror. The next morning, the Sterling mansion sat in silence. Once the halls had echoed with dinner parties. The clinking of crystal glasses and the chatter of politicians, celebrities, and tycoons. Now, the marble floors reflected only Richard's solitary footsteps as he moved aimlessly through the house. He paused in the living room, his gaze falling on a cracked leather basketball resting in the corner. Dust had settled on it. He picked it up, running his fingers over the faded signature scrawled across it, Daniels, written proudly years ago after his first tournament win. The memory struck hard. Flashback. 3 years earlier, the living room had been alive then. Daniel, 17, strode in with sweat still dripping from his hair, his jersey crumpled from the game. He held up a gold trophy, Daniel grinning. Dad, we won. I scored 20 points. Look. He placed the trophy on the table with pride. Richard had been on the phone, pacing back and forth, arguing with a client about an overseas deal. Richard covering phone, distracted. That's great, son. Really great. Just hold on a second. Turned away, a voice sharp into the phone. Richard? No, listen. I don't care what Tokyo says. If they won't sign, we'll take the deal to Berlin. It's final. Daniel stood there, his smile slowly fading. He waited and waited. His father's conversation dragged on. Louder, angrier, more consumed. Finally, Daniel whispered, Daniel, you weren't there. You promised you'd come, and you didn't. Richard didn't hear it. Maybe he did, but he ignored it. Daniel clenched his jaw, grabbed the marker from the table, and scrawled his name on the basketball. He dropped it with a thud at Richard's feet. Daniel, maybe you'll remember me this way, since you don't see me at all. Richard spun, phone still to his ear, but the sight of Daniel storming out of the room froze him. Richard calling. Daniel, wait, I'll make it up to you, I promise. But the boy didn't turn back. The door slammed, shaking the walls. Back to present, Richard's hands trembled as he held the basketball now. His throat burned. Richard whispering, I promised. I promised I'd make it up to him, and I never did. I sank into the couch, clutching the ball against his chest like a lifeline. That evening, he found himself walking again, almost. Without thought, back toward the park bench. And there, as though he had never moved, Samuel sat waiting. Richard lowered himself beside him, dropping the ball between his feet. Richard, he left me. My son, 3 years ago, and I never chased him. Samuel glanced at the ball, then at Richard, his expression unreadable. Samuel, why not? Richard's voice cracked. Richard, because I told myself he'd come back. I told myself there'd be time. Tomorrow, always tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes clouded. Samuel, that's the cruelest lie we tell ourselves, that there's time. I told myself the same once. Richard turned toward him, studying the lines etched deep into his face. Richard, your daughter. Samuel's lips pressed together. His hands tightened into fists on his lap. Samuel, she was 12, bright as the sun. She wanted me to read to her every night. Wanted me to sit at her school plays, her choir, her silly little science fairs. I always said I would, but I was working. Always working. I was a craftsman then. Built furniture. I thought if I'd built enough, earned enough, she'd thank me one day. He stopped, his voice breaking. Samuel softly. One day never came. Cancer took her before I ever kept my promises. The words hung heavy, like stones sinking into water. Richard's breath caught. He had thought Samuel was just some ragged old man with advice. But now he saw the truth. Samuel wasn't preaching from pride. He was bleeding from regret. Richard hoarse, I'm sorry. Samuel shook his head, his eyes glistening. Samuel, don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for yourself if you don't learn from me. That's why I speak to you, Richard, because you still have a chance.
Oh.
Richard looked down at the ball at his feet. His hands gripped it tighter. His voice trembled. Richard, but what if? Daniel won't forgive me? What if he's already decided I'm not his father anymore? Samuel leaned forward, his voice sharp but filled with an odd warmth. Samuel, then you show him anyway. Forgiveness isn't a gift you demand, it's one you earn. Sometimes you earn it just by standing there, by being present when they least expect it. Richard sat in silence, Samuel's words piercing him like truth he'd buried for years. For the first time, Richard didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a boy, lost, searching for a father figure. And strangely enough, in this ragged beggar, he found one. That night, back in his office, Richard pulled out his calendar. Meetings, mergers, calls, all meaningless in the weight of what Samuel had said. His hand hovered, then decisively crossed. Out a line of appointments, he whispered to himself, almost in disbelief. Richard, I'm going to his game. Whether he wants me there or not, I'll be there. The following Friday evening, the Sterling mansion once again sat lit with golden chandeliers, but this time it wasn't for guests or business partners. It was Richard, standing in front of his mirror, knotting his tie, his hands trembling with an anxiety he hadn't felt in decades. This wasn't a board meeting. This wasn't a billion-dollar merger. This was something far scarier. This was facing his son. The basketball Daniel had signed sat on the dresser, staring at him like an accusing eye. Richard ran his fingers over the fading ink. Richard whispering to himself, "Don't back out this time. Not again." The drive to the school gymnasium was a blur. Richard's chauffeur had been surprised when he gave the order. Chauffeur. "The Sterling Tower, sir?" Richard shaking his head. "No, Lincoln High School, the basketball game." The man raised his brows but said nothing. Richard sat in silence the entire way, his thoughts louder than the hum of the engine. What? If he tells me to leave? What if he doesn't even look at me? What if I've already lost him forever? The car pulled up in front of the old red-bricked high school. Parents clustered at the entrance, chatting and laughing, children running around with popcorn. Almost foreign to Richard, who had spent years surrounded only by suits, assistants, and power brokers. He stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, drawing glances from strangers. His tailored suit stood out against the casual sweaters and jackets of the crowd. Some parents recognized him and whispered, "Is that Richard Sterling?" Richard ignored them. His heart was too heavy for pride. Inside the gym buzzed with energy. The squeak of sneakers, the echo of basketballs, the roar of cheers. Froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the normalcy of it all. Then his eyes found him. Daniel, tall, lean, his brown hair damp with sweat. He wore jersey number 11. The boy moved across the court with a grace Richard had never seen. Quick passes, sharp shots, a leader among his teammates. The crowd cheered when he sank a three-pointer, his name chanted by classmates. Crowd Daniel. 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 Richard's chest swelled with pride and ache. That was his son, his flesh and blood. And yet Daniel didn't even know he was there. He took a seat in the back row, away from the noise. His hands clutched the signed basketball he had brought with him, as though holding it gave him the right to sit there. At halftime, the players jogged off the court. Daniel grabbed a water bottle, laughing with teammates. Richard's throat tightened at the sight. He wanted to call his name, to rush down the steps, but his legs wouldn't move. Fear pinned him, and then Daniel's eyes swept across the bleachers. For a brief second, they locked with Richard's. The laughter faded from his face. His eyes narrowed. Richard's heart plummeted. The game resumed. Daniel played with fury now. Faster, sharper, every move brimming with unspoken anger. He scored again and again, but he never once glanced back at the stands. When the game ended, Lincoln High had won by 10 points. The students rushed the court, lifting Daniel onto their shoulders, cheering his name. He raised his hands, smiling until his eyes flicked toward the back row again. Richard was still there, clutching the ball. Daniel's smile faltered. He slipped down from his teammates' shoulders and stormed toward the locker room without a word. Richard swallowed hard. His chance was slipping away. He rose, pushing past the crowd, and followed the hallway toward the locker rooms. The smell of sweat and cheap detergent filled the air. He stopped at the door marked "Players Only." He hesitated. His hand hovered over the handle. Richard to himself, "He'll hate me. He'll push me away. But I can't walk out this time." He pushed the door open. Inside, Daniel sat on a bench, pulling off his sneakers. When he saw his father, his face hardened. Daniel coldly. "What are you doing here?" Richard's voice trembled. "Richard, I came to see you play." Daniel laughed bitterly, standing. "Daniel now, after 3 years, missed every game, every championship, every single moment that mattered, and now you show up?" Richard clutched the ball tighter, his voice breaking. "Richard, I was wrong, Daniel. I thought I had time." "I thought," Daniel, cutting him off. "You always thought, you always promised." "Next time, son. Tomorrow, son." But tomorrow never came, Dad. The words hit like knives. Richard felt his knees weaken, wanted to argue, to defend himself. But the truth was undeniable. He had failed. He stepped closer, holding out the signed ball. "Richard," softly, "I kept this all these years. You signed it the day you walked out on me. It's the only piece of you I had left. I came tonight because I don't want to lose you forever." Daniel stared at the ball, his eyes flickering with pain and anger. He shook his head. "Daniel, you can't just walk back into my life because you feel guilty. That's not how this works." He grabbed his bag and pushed past his father, Richard calling after him, desperate. "Then tell me how it works." "Tell me what I have to do, Daniel. Please, I'll do anything." Daniel stopped at the doorway, his back rigid. He didn't turn. His voice was quiet but sharp. "Daniel, be there. Not just once, not just tonight, always. If you can't do that, then don't bother." And with that, he was gone. Richard stood in the empty locker room, sound of his son's footsteps fading into the distance. He clutched the basketball to his chest, tears burning his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something. A chance when he left the school that night, Samuel was waiting outside the gates, sitting on the same bench as always. His ragged coat wrapped tight, his eyes knowing, Samuel smiling faintly. "So, you showed up." Richard sank beside him, exhausted. "Richard, he hates me." "Samuel, no. If he hated you, he wouldn't care that you were there. And hate is easy. Disappointment, that means he still wants a father." Richard turned to him, hope flickering in his eyes. "Richard, then maybe it isn't too late." Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "Samuel, it's never too late as long as you keep showing up." Richard nodded, his chest heavy but filled with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in years, he felt a path forward. It's not easy, not guaranteed, but real. The first step back had been taken. The following week, Richard sat in his grand study, staring at a blank sheet of stationery. The pen in his hand trembled not because he couldn't write, but because he didn't know how to begin. How? Did a father apologize for years of absence? He thought of Daniel, his laughter as a boy, his scowl as a teenager, the coldness in his eyes the last time they spoke. Every memory weighed on him like a stone pressing deeper into his chest. At last, Richard wrote 3 words: "I am sorry." The ink bled slightly into the page. It looked so small, so insufficient. He wrote more slowly, carefully. "I know I've failed you, Daniel. I failed to be the father you needed, and I've hidden behind excuses for too long. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to earn it. If you'll allow me, I want to be there for you now, not as a billionaire, not as the man who disappeared into his business, but as your father." When he finished, his hand ached, but his heart felt strangely lighter. He sealed the letter in an envelope, scrawled Daniel's name across it, and set it by the door. That evening, carried it with him to the park. Samuel was waiting. As always, Samuel nodding at the envelope. "Looks like a confession." Richard, half smiling, more like a surrender. Samuel chuckled softly. "Samuel, good. Pride ruins more families than poverty ever did. Pride keeps us from saying the words that matter most." Richard sighed, gazing at the letter. "Richard, do you think he'll even Daniel, don't make promises you can't keep." And with that, he walked away again. But this time Richard smiled, because it wasn't rejection. It was the beginning of something else, the beginning of a second chance. It had been nearly 3 months since Richard first showed up at the gym. In that time, little shifts had taken place, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet powerful. Daniel didn't exactly welcome him, but he no longer bristled at his presence. Parents noticed Richard's steady attendance and whispered quietly, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. The kids asked Daniel once or twice who the man was. Daniel avoided answering. Still, the fact that Richard was allowed to stay, week after week, spoke volumes. One late evening, after practice had ended and the gym had emptied, Daniel finally approached him, not with the usual guarded tone, but with something almost resembling curiosity. Daniel carefully, "You really don't have anything better to do than sit through my practices?" Richard chuckled softly, though the sound carried a tremor. "Richard, I've done everything else. Built companies, flown across the world, bought things I thought would fill the emptiness. None of it mattered. This, watching you, seeing what kind of man you've become, this matters." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, as though testing the sincerity in his words. "Daniel, you missed so much. First games, graduations, birthdays. I used to think if I ever saw you again, I'd never speak to you. But here you are, and I don't even know how to feel, Richard quietly. Confused, angry, maybe even hopeful. You don't have to pick one. Daniel's lips twitched as though resisting a reluctant smile. For the first time, the wall between them thinned, ever so slightly. Over the following weeks, Daniel allowed more interaction. After practices, Richard began helping put away basketballs or wiping down benches. It was menial work, hardly fitting for a billionaire, but it mattered. The kids grew curious. One brave boy, Malik, finally asked, "Coach, is that your dad?" The question hung heavy in the air. Daniel froze, staring at Richard. For a second, Richard thought Daniel would deny it. His heart thudded, bracing for rejection. But Daniel only muttered, "Something like that," before walking away. Something like that. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't denial. For Richard, it was more than he deserved. Then came the night of the fundraiser. The community center was struggling. Repairs were overdue, funding was scarce, and the future of the youth program hung in jeopardy. Daniel, ever resourceful, organized a local fundraiser raffles, food stalls. Even a small basketball tournament, Richard, for the first time, offered help. "Richard, let me contribute," quietly. No press, no announcements, just enough to keep the place running. Daniel hesitated, his pride warred with practicality. Finally, he agreed on one condition. "Daniel, this isn't about your money. If you do this, it's because these kids need it, not because you want to buy your way back into my life." Richard firmly understood. The fundraiser was a success. Families gathered, laughter filled the air, and Daniel's team won their game. For once, there was joy unshadowed by bitterness. Afterward, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Richard sat on the bleachers. Watching the kids eat pizza and run wild across the court, it felt almost normal, almost like family. "Daniel, softly, sometimes I wondered what it would have been like if you'd stayed, if Mom hadn't. If things hadn't turned out the way they did." The name Mom was a knife Richard hadn't been prepared for. His chest constricted, guilt flooding him. "Richard, I failed her too. The night she needed me most, I wasn't there." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Daniel, she begged you not to go to that business trip. She told me once. She said she felt something was wrong." What? The memory struck Richard like a blow. He remembered that night vividly, her pleading eyes, his insistence that he couldn't cancel. He remembered the phone call that shattered everything. The car accident, the hospital, his wife gone. Tears welled in his eyes, Richard hoarse. "I thought I had time. I thought I'd come back to her and to you when things settled. I didn't know it would be the last time I saw her alive." Daniel's fists tightened. Daniel angrily. "But she did know. And you didn't listen. You chose your work over us, and it cost her life. Do you know what that did to me? Watching her die and realizing my father wasn't there." Richard bowed his head, broken. "Richard, I live with that guilt every single day. It eats me alive. Can't change what I did. I can only beg for your forgiveness, though I don't deserve it." The gym fell silent, except for the distant shouts of children. Daniel's eyes glistened with tears, his anger colliding with sorrow. For a long moment, Richard thought he had ruined everything, that the fragile thread between them would snap. Then Daniel whispered, his voice raw, "Daniel, do you even know what it was like for me? After she died, lone, angry, abandoned." Richard forced himself to look at his son, tears streaming freely. "Richard, tell me. Please. I want to know everything I missed, no matter how much it hurts." And for the first time, Daniel opened up. He spoke of sleepless nights, of bullying in school, of working part-time jobs to cover what little his relatives could not. He spoke of standing at his mother's grave alone on birthdays, whispering, words meant for both parents. He spoke of the bitterness that hardened him, the loneliness that never left. Richard listened, silent, broken, never once interrupting. When Daniel finished, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his chest, heaving. "Daniel, quietly. That's what you missed. That's who I became without you." Richard reached out, hesitating before gently resting a trembling hand on his son's arm. Richard's voice breaking. "And look at who you are now. Strong, compassionate, a leader. Everything I should have taught you became on your own. I am proud of you, Daniel, more than words can say." Daniel's lips trembled, torn between resistance and longing. For years he had craved those words, even if he swore he didn't need them. Hearing them now stirred something buried deep within. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. He pulled back, standing abruptly. Daniel shaking his head. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet." "What?" Richard rose too, his face wet with tears. "Richard, then I'll wait, as long as it takes." Daniel stared at him for a moment, then turned and walked away into the night. Richard remained on the bleachers, the weight of grief pressing down. Yet amid the sorrow, there was also a strange, fragile relief. For the first time, Daniel had let him see the depth of his pain, and sometimes the breaking point wasn't the end. Sometimes it was the beginning.